The biggest invasion in history began before dawn. Over 5,000 ships pushed through the cold waters of the English Channel. Inside, American soldiers sat in silence, faces pale under the flickering lights. They had been waiting for this moment for months, the day they would step onto Fortress Europe. At exactly 5:30, the first landing craft hit the sand of Omaha Beach. The ramp dropped. Chaos exploded. Bullets tore through the air like a swarm of bees. Men stumbled into the surf, pulling each other forward, tripping over bodies and equipment. The sea turned dark. Yet still, they moved, step by step, through water, smoke, and fire. Behind them, destroyers fired over their heads, shaking the ground with each blast. Overhead, the sky thundered with aircraft, hundreds of bombers and gliders cutting through the dawn. The air smelled of salt and cordite. Commands were lost in the roar. For the soldiers on the beach, time no longer existed, only survival. They had been told this was the turning point of the war, that once they broke through the defenses, Europe could finally be free again. And on that morning, nothing else mattered. Not fear, not exhaustion, not even the thought of death. Just one goal: move forward. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, deep in a forest near Berlin, the headquarters of the Third Reich was waking up slowly. The phones were ringing. Officers rushed from room to room, shouting half-understood reports. Messages from France spoke of massive landings, endless columns of ships, aircraft everywhere. But there was one voice missing, the only one that mattered. Adolf Hitler was asleep. His staff stood frozen in the corridors, whispering. No one dared to knock on his door. They knew his temper, his fury, the humiliation that came with waking him too early. Hours passed as the world changed outside. On the beaches of Normandy, American, British, and Canadian soldiers were dying by the thousands. But in Hitler's compound, nothing moved. One adjutant suggested waking him. He was silenced immediately. Another argued that this was too serious to delay. Still, the door remained closed. The fate of Europe was waiting behind it. At 8, Allied troops had secured their first foothold. At 9, they were pushing inland. At 10, Hitler was still asleep. The man who demanded absolute control over every decision in Germany had, for the first time, lost control of the war, simply because he wasn't awake to fight it. The greatest military operation in history was unfolding without him, and when he finally opened his eyes, the mistake that would doom his empire had already begun. When Hitler finally opened his eyes, the war was already burning. His aides were waiting outside his room, pale, exhausted, and terrified. They had been listening for any sound for hours, a cough, a step, anything that meant they could finally enter. At last, the door creaked open. The most feared man in Europe had woken up. He sat down to breakfast, calm, detached. His adjutant approached with trembling hands, holding the first reports from France. Massive Allied landings at Normandy, thousands of ships, paratroopers behind enemy lines. Hitler looked at the papers in silence, then at the faces around him. "It's a diversion," he said coldly. The officers exchanged glances. They had been hearing reports all morning, radio intercepts, photographs, frantic calls from commanders on the coast. Everything pointed to one truth. This was the invasion they had been expecting for months. But Hitler refused to believe it. He was convinced the real attack would come at Calais, further north. It wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. He had been misled brilliantly. For months, Allied intelligence had fed the Germans a steady diet of lies, fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, even double agents sending false reports. Hitler had believed it all, and now, when the truth was right in front of him, he couldn't see it. His generals pressed him. "My Führer, this is no diversion. The landings are enormous." But Hitler waved them off. He traced a finger across the map, stopping at Calais. "That's where the real blow will fall," he said. "Normandy is only the bait." In that moment, the The German war machine froze. No reinforcements moved. No armored divisions rolled. Every decision had to come from one man, and that man had made the wrong call. Back in France, American troops were paying the price of every minute he hesitated. At Omaha Beach, they were fighting through a wall of machine guns and mortars. Communication was chaos. Many officers were dead. Others used helmets as makeshift signals to lead their men. A few tanks managed to reach the sand, but were quickly destroyed. Still, the Americans pushed forward inch by inch, turning craters into cover. While young soldiers fought for their lives, Hitler sat in his map room, surrounded by silence. His staff waited for him to change his mind, but he didn't. To him, the invasion at Normandy was still a trick, a feint designed to draw his forces away from the real target. By midday, Allied troops had already broken through parts of the German line. Bridges were being captured, supply routes secured. Radio operators sent urgent messages to headquarters. "We need reinforcements now. The enemy is advancing." But the response from Berlin never came. At 1 in the afternoon, Hitler gave his first clear order: wait. He wanted confirmation that the Calais sector remained quiet. Only then, he said, would he consider moving the panzer divisions. His generals could hardly believe what they were hearing. Every minute lost meant stronger Allied positions, more troops landing, and less chance of driving them back into the sea. By the time Hitler's mind began to shift, the day was already half over. The chance for a decisive counterattack was slipping away, buried under his certainty that he was right. He had woken up, yes, but he hadn't seen. And that single decision, to trust his own conviction over the evidence of his commanders, was the moment Germany began to lose the war. By mid-morning on June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were a storm of noise and smoke. American troops were still pinned down behind low dunes and shattered obstacles. Every wave of men brought new life and new losses. They waited for something that could finally break the German line: tanks. The plan had been clear. Once the first waves landed, armored divisions would come ashore to push inland, steel against concrete, fire against bunkers. But most of the special amphibious tanks never made it. Many sank before reaching the beach, swallowed by rough seas and heavy surf. The men who survived the crossing fought with rifles and grenades against fortified positions that were never meant to fall to infantry alone. On the German side, tanks were not the problem. They had them. Powerful Panther and Panzer divisions were stationed only a few hours away. The problem was permission. None of those divisions could move without Hitler's personal order. And Hitler, still convinced the invasion was fake, refused to release them. At his headquarters, frantic officers delivered new reports by the minute. They showed photographs of Allied ships stretching to the horizon. They read intercepted communications proving the landings were real. "We must send the armor now," one general insisted. Hitler's answer was the same: wait, the real invasion is still to come, at Calais. Every hour, the situation at Omaha grew worse. American units were running low on ammunition. Medics worked without pause, crawling through the sand to pull the wounded back under fire. Navy destroyers moved dangerously close to the shore, firing directly at German positions to clear a path for the trapped infantry. Slowly, painfully, the beach began to turn in their favor. But the soldiers on the ground didn't know how close they were to disaster. If German tanks had rolled in that morning, the invasion might have failed. Historians still debate it, how a few hours, a few orders, could have changed everything. In the early afternoon, Field Marshal Rommel's staff begged for authority to move the panzer divisions. Rommel himself wasn't there. He had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday, expecting a quiet week. His absence became another stroke of fate. Without his direct command, local officers hesitated, waiting for Berlin. At last, just before evening, the order came: release the armor. The panzers started their engines and rolled toward Normandy. But by then, The sky belonged to the Allies. Hundreds of fighters and bombers circled overhead. The German columns became easy targets, burning along the narrow French roads before they could even reach the coast. On the beaches, American troops watched the smoke rising inland and realized what had happened. Reinforcements were finally coming, but not for the enemy. The long wait, the unbearable losses, had bought them time. 12 hours earlier, those same tanks could have crushed the landings. Now, they were nothing but wreckage and flame. The outcome of D-Day had turned on the simplest of failures, one man's refusal to believe the truth. And while American soldiers dug into the French soil they had fought so hard to reach, Hitler still stared at his maps, searching for a battle that would never come. Why did Hitler ignore what was right in front of him? How could a man who built his reputation on strategy fail to see the most obvious truth of the war? The answer lies in one of the most brilliant deception operations ever created, and in Hitler's complete belief in his own instincts. Months before D-Day, the Allies began a plan so elaborate that even today it seems like fiction. It was called Operation Fortitude. Its goal was simple: convince Hitler that the invasion of France would come not at Normandy, but at Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. They built a phantom army. Along the British coast, entire fields filled with inflatable tanks and fake aircraft, trucks made of plywood, dummy landing craft lined up on beaches that would never see battle. Real soldiers sent fake radio messages, while double agents fed Berlin stories that matched the illusion perfectly. And at the head of this imaginary force, they placed the man Hitler feared most, General George S. Patton. German reconnaissance planes flew over these camps and photographed the army. Radio signals confirmed what they expected to find. To Hitler, it all looked perfect, too perfect to be a lie. He became certain the real invasion would come at Calais. He even ordered his best armored divisions to stay there, ready to crush an attack that never came. When reports of the Normandy landings arrived, they didn't fit his picture of the world. In his mind, the Allies were too smart to strike where defenses were strongest. Normandy, he told his generals, was the distraction. The real blow would fall elsewhere. Every new message that contradicted him was ignored, explained away, or dismissed as Allied trickery. His generals were trapped. They could see the truth, but the structure of the regime left them powerless. Every movement, every order required Hitler's approval, and Hitler trusted no one. Even Rommel's earlier warnings, his plea to reinforce Normandy months before the invasion, had been brushed aside. While the Allies used creativity and cooperation, the German command drowned in fear and hierarchy. One side adapted, the other waited for permission. Back in Normandy, that difference was everything. As Hitler clung to his illusion, American engineers built roads off the beaches, British troops pushed through hedgerows, Canadian forces secured villages one by one. Every hour of his doubt became another step toward Allied victory. Still, even late that night, Hitler refused to believe. Reports piled up showing the scale of the operation, hundreds of ships, thousands of paratroopers, entire divisions ashore, yet he insisted it was all a trick. "They want us to think this is the invasion," he told his staff, "but the real one is coming at Calais." He had been outsmarted not by numbers, but by imagination. The Allies won that day because they made Hitler see what they wanted him to see, and because he refused to look beyond it. The illusion had worked perfectly, but it wasn't just the enemy that fooled him, it was his own mind. And by the time he realized it, reality had already won. By the end of June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were secure. Smoke drifted over the cliffs, ships filled the horizon, and tens of thousands of Allied soldiers had made it to French soil. It had cost more than 10,000 casualties in a single day, but the impossible had been done. The invasion had succeeded. In Berlin, the news arrived too late to matter. Hitler finally ordered the panzers to move in full force, but by then the Allies had dug in deep. Artillery batteries were set, anti-tank guns in place, fighter planes circling above. The counter-attack that might have crushed the invasion now became a slaughter of German armor. Every burned tank was another hour lost, another sign that the war had turned. Within days, the Allies built artificial harbors to unload supplies. Endless convoys brought tanks, fuel, and food onto the beaches. Each sunrise, more ships appeared, more men stepped onto French soil. The Germans had missed their only real chance to throw them back. The balance of power in Europe was shifting, one mistake at a time. Hitler's generals knew it. Some began to whisper that the war was unwinnable. A few even started plotting to remove him, convinced his leadership was destroying Germany. But Hitler refused to see what everyone else already knew. He blamed his officers, his intelligence staff, even the weather, anyone but himself. For the Americans who fought on D-Day, the victory was far from clean. They had landed into chaos and climbed out through courage alone. Every hill, every village was bought with lives. Yet they had done what once seemed impossible, opened the road to liberation. The tide of war had turned, not through luck or numbers, but through human will and through the enemy's blindness. As the weeks passed, the world began to see the cost of that blindness. France was being freed town by town. German forces retreated toward Paris, and the myth of Nazi invincibility collapsed with every kilometer. What began as a single morning's hesitation became the unraveling of an empire. In the months that followed, Hitler's isolation deepened. His decisions grew erratic, his circle smaller. He still insisted that the Allies would strike again at Calais, even when their armies were already racing across France. Reality had beaten him long before the final shots were fired, and it all traced back to that one morning, when he slept through history, then refused to believe it when he woke up. The lesson endures. Power built on fear cannot adapt. Leadership without trust cannot see. And certainty, when it blinds you to truth, becomes its own defeat. D-Day was not just a battle. It was a turning point in the story of humanity's fight against tyranny, a moment when courage met arrogance and won. If you found this story fascinating, join us for more untold moments that shaped the world. Subscribe, leave a comment, and discover the hidden sides of history, one story at a time.